Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society was the first historical society in America, and we've been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our nation's history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of manuscripts that is measured in the millions, with the papers of US presidents, soldiers, mothers, pioneers, and everyone in between. We publish these collections, we make them available to researchers, and we host an active schedule of programs that explore our shared American history. This evening, I'm happy to welcome you to our first program since the COVID-19 state of emergency has ended in Massachusetts. We are still, however, hosting virtual programs for the next couple of months. We make our collections and our online programming available for free, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members. If you are not a supporter of MHS, I hope you'll consider joining to support our work. This evening, we're in for a special program. We are joined by Dr. Lynne Cheney, who will speak about her new book, The Virginia Dynasty, Four Presidents and the Creation of the American Nation. Dr. Cheney is the former Second Lady of America. She has had a distinguished career with much of her professional life writing and speaking about the importance of knowing American history and teaching it well. She is the author or co-author of 12 books, including 6 bestsellers about American history for children. She also served for 7 years as the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities and is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She received her bachelor's degree from Colorado College, her master's degree from the University of Colorado in Boulder, and her PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She will be joined by MHS's own Catherine Allgor. Prior to coming to MHS, Dr. Allgor was the Director of Education at the Huntington Library in California, and before that, a professor of history and UC Presidential Chair at the University of California, Riverside. She attended Mount Holyoke College and received her PhD from Yale University. So without further ado, Dr. Cheney and Dr. Allgor, if you'd like to join us and kick off the program.
Thanks so much, Gavin.
There, I'm here too.
You are. Hello, Lynne Cheney.
How are you? Such a pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. We wish we were in person, welcoming you into the home of John Adams, as it were. But
oh my goodness, yes.
Historic times. So I have to say, I was enjoying that little picture from our collection, the map, because I've been thinking a lot about the power of place in history. And of course,
yes,
right there in the book. And you and I share places as well. So full disclosure to our audience, Lynne and I know each other. And we met when she was working on her James Madison biography. And we met in the finest of places, James Madison and Dolly Madison's home, Montpelier. And I also remember a wonderful afternoon racing around with you in the Virginia countryside, trying to find the exact spot that Dolly Madison watched Washington burn from. So my relationship is really all about place, Lynne, I'll tell you. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that later, but let's start with the basics. So
sure.
A lot has been written about the founding. A lot has been written about the 4 stars of your book. But what did you hope to accomplish with your take?
Well, first, I came to the subject as a result of working on the book about Madison, because I understood, once I was deeply into it, that his life was so intertwined with the other 3 men, the other Virginia presidents. And when I began to look into what that meant, it was really stunning to me. It brings out anecdotes, it brings out history, it brings out quarrels, it brings out friendships in a way that doesn't happen, I think, if you look at the men one-on-one. And you're actually able to bring forward information. There's no new information, is there? But information that is unfamiliar to most of us.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the book, for our audience here who haven't bought their copies yet, but will, it's chronological sort of tale, and it starts in the beginning of the Revolution and to the end of the Monroe administration. But what Lynne does is she takes these moments and does a kind of juxtaposition, or maybe it's a side-by-side comparison. And what you see is that there are issues, and this is what I want to ask you, what issues kind of brought them together and what issues drove them apart?
they were brought together, I think, by the opportunity they saw, the education they had, that enabled them to participate in the Enlightenment's admiration of justice, freedom, liberty. And that's what united them. Now, of course, it's a long way to get from where they were to where the country ended up when, at the time, James Monroe died. And in the course of that journey, they were sometimes very helpful to one another. They often quarreled. They became estranged from one another. So it's an interesting human story too, to see that, it wasn't just a band of brothers. It was much more than that. And I think more human. It makes them more human to understand the difficulties that they had.
Yeah. Now, I always assumed, just thinking, that these guys were all in touch with each other over these sort of like 30 years or so. But the truth is, there were rifts, and there were times where, George Washington is not talking to Monroe for years at a time, or Madison and Monroe aren't talking. And that was very surprising to me.
I think the most surprising to me was that Washington ended up estranged from the other three, that after he left office even sooner, he simply lost confidence in them, and he certainly no longer had their support and confidence.
Yeah, and I have to say, of the four men, so we're talking about the four, obviously the four Virginians, the sort of breakout star. If you were going to write a rap musical, this is the guy you would write about, is James Monroe. And I'm really
Interesting.
well, he kind of emerges from their shadow. And I was thinking about why he hasn't been a bigger figure. Part of it was he was gone a lot of the time. He was overseas, but you could say that about Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about the sort of the storyline you constructed for James Monroe?
He was the poorest of the three, of the four starting out. He was sort of at the low end of the Virginia gentry. His family was. And I think that made him, when he compared himself to others, he went to school with John Marshall, for example. I think that made him very anxious to succeed. The idea, he would watch other people, like he would watch Madison, and say to himself, that fellow has got himself to where he is because he worked very hard and he persisted. And he would emulate the qualities that he saw in others that he believed were important to success. So in some ways, he is a self-fashioned person. He made himself into what he was, and managed to hide less attractive features. He had a terrible temper. And I was amused to find that one of the ways he exercised it without causing a great public hullabaloo was to write the nastiest letters you can imagine and essays you can imagine. The one about Washington is really devastating. But then he never sent the letters or never published the memos. The curious thing to me is, why did he leave them in his papers? There's no limit to the questions that you can ask about human nature.
Oh my gosh, yeah, you wonder how conscious he is. Well, I felt very sort of moved by him, because one of the other things that he sort of had a reputation among people who maybe didn't like him as not being terribly brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, when you're hanging out with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, you're not going to look like that's tough. But he also had he was prepared and worked hard, and that was something you said he had in common with Washington, who, again, not necessarily an intellectual giant, again, in comparison, but he had, maybe that's what drew Washington and Monroe together.
Well, perhaps it didn't take them long to become estranged. Washington sent Monroe to Paris at the time that John Jay was negotiating the Jay Treaty, as we call it. And Jay felt that Monroe had double-crossed him by being much too positive about how the treaty would benefit France. And Monroe felt totally undercut by the fact that the Jay Treaty was not at all favorable to France, and he'd been telling the French it was. He was summoned home and spent a good deal of time writing a very nasty book about Washington. This is one that got published. And it's such an interesting book. It has a long title, like maybe 46 words, but A Vindication is the short title. He so angered Washington with this book that there are marginal notes in the original of this, which of course has been reproduced many times. So you can see Washington refuting Monroe as he sits there and burns with anger at what this young man has said.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, that's yeah, you can absolutely see it happening in the margins. Now, of course, one of the big issues of the time that has to be dealt with in any history of this time is slavery.
Hmm.
And you weave this through the book and the kind of changing story of slavery. Can we talk a little bit about how you treated it in your narrative?
Well, I treated it, or I, of course, shared totally the feeling that these four men had, that slavery was immoral, it was awful, it was a sin against God, but they couldn't see a way out. Gary Wills once used an interesting image. He talked about Jefferson on the subject of slavery being trammeled in a net. How do you get out? You know, the idea of total and complete emancipation on one day in 1 year would have led to chaos and to killing. And when they tried gradual emancipation toward the end of most of their lives, that didn't work so well either. People thought they were trying to whitewash slavery. So it was a terrible dilemma, and something they could see no way out of. And at the meantime, they had this opportunity that so few people can even imagine, to create a world anew and to do it on the basis of Enlightenment principles like liberty, justice, and equality. Interesting people have commented on this. Abraham Lincoln had no real love for Jefferson. He had read a book about the Hemmings scandal, as it was thought of, and so really just didn't like Jefferson at all. But he praised Jefferson for putting ideals in the Declaration of Independence that inspired people to overcome ideas, notions, practices like slavery. He thought that Jefferson had laid out a harbinger, you know, that would frighten away anyone who even thought about going there ever again once we had eliminated slavery, as he hoped to do. The other person who praised them for their setting forth ideals is Frederick Douglass, who said, if you took the preface to the Constitution of the United States of America and you lived up to its ideals, slavery would be gone. And those are important notions, you know, that they brought forth ideals that ultimately proved a powerful weapon, maybe the most powerful one, against slavery.
And you know, it's interesting when we talk, so we popularly known, if you were on a game show, so James Monroe is the last of the founding generation to be president. He's the last president to wear knee breeches, the old style. But when you think about, you were set that this founding group thought of slavery as a necessary evil. Didn't know what to do, knew it was bad, didn't know what to do about it. But Monroe lives and becomes president at a time where there's this shift in arguing the Missouri Compromise, where slavery goes from being a necessary evil that we just don't know what to do, to being argued as a positive good. So what?
Oh, that is so shocking, you know, when the Missouri Compromise accomplished what many of its advocates wanted it to. It aligned the North against the South. You know, it was no longer a matter of you'd have a free state here and a slave state there. They were aligned, and they were aligned on the subject of slavery. And that Thomas Jefferson called it a fire bell in the night. that this was the beginning of the end, probably of the South, probably maybe the whole country, that we would have this alignment. So Monroe was there. He thought the treaty was good. He thought it was fine. I can't imagine that there could have been a good one, but this one, of course, ended up being destructive.
Yeah, really. Yes, just sped the whole process along.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a really sort of almost poignant moment too that you talk about, and this is now James Madison, our old friend, where he's very old, he's in retirement, and everybody and their brother comes to visit him, and one of those people is Harriet Martineau. Can you talk a little bit about that visit and who she was?
Well, she was a noted feminist. She intellectual too. I don't mean to just put her in a one belief category. She was a woman of deep thought. And Dolly, who sort of oversaw who got to see Madison, thought that was a great idea, and so did the former president. And their conversation went on and on and on, covering everything you can imagine. But it was slavery, she reported, that Madison returned to again and again as this practice that he so regretted. At that point, he was involved, along with Monroe, in the American Colonization Society. This was the effort to encourage freeing slaves by providing them transportation to Liberia, is what the country became known as. And it worked in some small way, but it was very small. And it upset abolitionists no small bit, because they saw it as a way to whitewash slavery. You know, here we're going to just take the formerly enslaved people and just give them a new home. But of course, a lot of those people, most of those people, thought of America as home. They thought of Virginia particularly as home, and had little interest. But in any case, Madison said to Harriet Martineau, if I could hold on to one little bit of comfort on this subject, and it's not much, it would be the American Colonization Society. But of course, that ended up being nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, and she's, as you mentioned, intellectual, very, formidable, really. And she sort of despaired a little bit, and you quote her in the book about what a fine mind he had, but
Yes.
he got stuck on the slavery thing. He could not figure his way out of it. And
Yeah.
what a challenge that was for somebody like him. Well, listen, I know you don't write a lot about this, but I would not be doing my job as the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society if I didn't ask you about John Adams. He doesn't get to be in this book a lot because he's not a Virginian, but I wondered if you enjoyed encountering him, at least on the page.
Well, he makes some grumpy appearances, but some of them are just quite amusing. Dolly had not met Washington, and Adams had, and so he described Washington to her. Then she met Washington. I don't mean Dolly, I mean Abigail. John Adams' wife, Abigail, had not met Washington, but John described him to her. And she wrote John afterward. She said, "You did not tell me the half of it." And John, who had a bit of a spicy, could spice up an anecdote with almost anything, said, "You're right. He has 5 great gifts." And I don't know if I'll get the whole list, but he's tall. He has a handsome face. He's very graceful in dancing and in horsemanship. And moreover, he has a sizable fortune. And he saw those as Washington's great strengths.
That really does sound like John. Absolutely. Yeah. But listen, I'm going to take advantage of your slip of a tongue, and let's talk about wives and families, because that was a crucial part of your story as well. And again, sometimes when people write about these guys, they write about them as though they came from nowhere and disappeared. But can you talk a little bit about the role of the wives and families?
Well, Washington had the comfort of Martha. She came to every winter camp, and that was not an easy thing to do. She was knitting socks with other wives at Valley Forge. She was an immense source of comfort to Washington, but he had an eye for pretty women and never forgot Sally Fairfax. Had quite a flirtation with a very wealthy and beautiful woman named Elizabeth Powell. Uh, and he said to Elizabeth Powell once, she claimed, and it turns out she was right, that she'd found love letters of Washington's. Well, now they were actually letters from Martha to Washington, but she did find them. And she called them love letters. And Washington wrote back and he said, I can't imagine that you found love letters. If there's anything in my life, it's friendship. Now, I thought to myself, how in the world would Martha have appreciated that? Madison. Now, you taught me so much about Dolly, that she was a performer, that she did not hold herself back as most women did. She did not want all sign of her destroyed, as most women did, and they burned their letters, which is just such a loss, but not Dolly. And, she even made the letters, as you point out in your book, she even made the letters into kind of a narrative so that you got a whole story about the burning of Washington. She was really a unique and in many ways fabulous person. And I appreciate your having introduced that part to me.
Well, and now she's a Virginian as well. I mean, we know so the first two women we've talked about were Virginians.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Dolly, as you know, moved away as a young girl to Philadelphia. And one of my theories as to why she married James Madison, who, brilliant guy, was not exactly a George Washington, if you know what I'm saying. But I think what he offered her was the chance to go back to Virginia. Now, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe she was not a Southerner.
Right. And she paid for it in a way. People always thought of her as, being a little too much of a New Yorker. And I take it that means restrained, and not laughing all the time, not sitting around banquet tables, and that wouldn't have been her idea of a good time. She was also ill, and her illness shaped a lot of Monroe's personal life. His older daughter served in the place of First Lady while he was president. She stepped on so many toes, this older daughter did. But as I read about her, I thought to myself, those were toes that deserve stepping on. So,
She
in any
has
case,
kind of reputation for being sort of sharp-tongued, but I think the phrase "does not suffer fools gladly" jumps to mind.
exactly. Well, there was this practice of going around and leaving cards at the houses of all of the high VIPs in Washington. And she just wouldn't do it. And I can imagine, what Washington was like then. It was just this city of dust, and when it rained, of mire and mud. Pulling yourself, taking a carriage, going through all of that to leave a calling card seemed silly to her. And I kind of think she was right.
Yeah, I do too, even though, that was Dolly's practice. She had instituted, so she kind of set the bar. And Louisa Catherine Adams, who followed Mrs. Monroe, or Eliza, Mrs. Hayes, she felt the onus of that too. Like, once Dolly had done it, she felt she had to do it too. No one liked it. No one liked it. It's just not a great practice. I'm going to shift our discussion a little bit, because our audience is an audience of readers and writers and historians. And in thinking of this idea of the power of place, and I should ask you about why Virginia, so maybe we'll get that in there too. I think about you becoming a historian in two kinds of places. One, literally Washington, D.C., surrounded by the monuments when you started your work, and then your own place in American history and in government. So as the wife of a government official and then a government official. So can you talk to us sort of about that journey of becoming a historian?
The Constitution was always the attraction for me. And even before the bicentennial of the Constitution, in what year, help me, this would have been 1987, 19, yes.
Yes, yes.
Um, Even before that year, when I was appointed to the Commission on the Bicentennial, I was fascinated. I mean, how could there be a document that changed the world? And it exactly did that. So I was on the Bicentennial Commission. One way or another, I kept the Constitution kept being a part of my thought. And you can't think about the Constitution and have it with you and not be an historian. You know, you've got to see its place and appreciate it. And if there's one thing I hope my children's books have done is increase an appreciation for the Constitution, the Declaration, and the men who were responsible for turning the world upside down and giving us the nation we have today. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, well, you were working on your doctorate in literature. So
Yeah.
you were, but something about being in Washington City, as we would
Yeah.
got you into it. Yeah.
Well, that's true. And I do think that, you know, I've benefited from having a front row seat on history for many, many years. You know, it just, you know, wrote an observation about John. How do you say it? Do you say Quincy or Quincy?
We say Quincy around here, but
Okay. But you forgive people who don't. In any case, I was telling an anecdote about John Quincy Adams and his relationship with Monroe, which was, you know, Quincy Adams was responsible really for the Monroe Doctrine. He never ever took credit for it. And he was a very proud man. He did take great credit for what was called the Adams-Onis Treaty, which extended the boundary of the United States to the Pacific Ocean. Very proud of that. But he never took credit for the Monroe Treaty, the Monroe Doctrine. And it seemed to me, and this I think probably came from my experience, he was a perfect Secretary of State. You know, he helped and he helped and he had intellect and he contributed and he never bragged about it. So
yeah, he would definitely be one of the top 3 secretaries of state that we have had. But I do wonder about your perspective. You are the only historian I've ever talked to who's been a second lady. So I don't know, what was that like to actually, you know, have that perspective?
Well, it was interesting. When Dick became vice president, it became pretty clear to me that I could not continue to write the book on education that I was writing. Education was George W. Bush's signature program, the thing that he most wanted to fix as president. And I couldn't be writing a book saying, this is how you fix it, while the president was off over here. I mean, it just seemed so awkward. So it was then that I started writing children's books, thinking that I couldn't get into a lot of trouble writing children's books. And it was so rewarding. And still today, I love those books so much.
I'm so glad you mentioned them, because I want to say another sort of thing is I don't usually talk to historians who write big bestsellers that look like this, who also write children's books. And you actually acknowledge that in your acknowledgments, and you thank the illustrators. I just thought that was very
Yeah,
gracious of you, because in a children's book, the illustration is so important.
exactly. And you have a close relationship, or at least I think you do in a compelling children's book with the illustrator. You know, if you're talking about the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton after that, and you talk about how George Washington was this amazing military figure riding around on a white horse, you need the illustrator to sort of have a picture, a painting of Washington on his white horse and the cannon booming. I have discovered that when Washington crossed the Delaware, which is the book I'm talking about, is the favorite book of most boys. Now, I don't know what this tells you, but I think they like the canon. I think they like the heroism. I think they like riding on a white charger. Girls like it too, but not with the same enthusiasm that boys do.
I think I'm a little bit of a girl in that, and I'll speak to you as a historian. I really admired the way you wrote about the battlefield scenes in the beginning of your book, and I always have such trouble with them. Part of it is I don't have the same kind of like adulation for the guy on the horse, but it's also a very spatial thing that you have to be able to imagine. And you wrote with such facility, but I think in a previous conversation you said it was a slog for you as well. Or are you just saying that to make me feel better?
No, I don't have, here I go hitting my PC. I don't have a sense of direction. I really, when someone says go north, I don't know what they mean. So it was real intellectual discipline to figure out the battlefield. But the battlefield played such an enormous role in this period. It was the battlefield where Washington basically fired his second in command, General Lee. It was his firing General Lee that helped contribute to the estrangement between Monroe and Washington, because Lee had been very nice to Monroe, complimented him, told him he was a great man. He just needed to be a little more assertive, a little less shy. So, Washington basically kicked out Monroe's hero. And for reasons, well, it's a complicated story, but, I'm not sure Washington had always, and in all parts of it, the right side of the matter.
Yeah.
But so see, the battlefield.
Yeah.
The battlefield is where this all started, because Washington thought that Lee had disobeyed him.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very dramatic. And so it may have been taxing for you. And I have to laugh. I'm the same way. If somebody says, go southwest, I'm like, unless it's an airplane, I can't. Do a great job with that. So before we're getting a lot of questions, and I'm just encourage the audience just to put your questions in the, I guess, in the chat or the Q&A. I'm sure it's very apparent to you all what it is out there. And we'll start doing them. But I wanted to kind of sort of get to the end of the story, because what's interesting about the end for all of our men, they may have had differences, but they had a couple things in common. One is Virginia, and maybe this is the moment where I say, what was it about Virginia? But they also had in common spectacular debt and or bad real estate stuff.
They did. Washington, the richest of the four, was able to make his way through even somewhat hard times because he had thousands upon thousands of acres of land. And he confessed to one of his helpmates that he sold this parcel, a very valuable one, and it helped him make up for deficits he was running for 3 or 4 years. The others, and Washington also did not encounter the Panic of 1819. If he had encountered it, I don't know if his land would have been so valuable, because the Panic of 1819, in that panic, everyone's wealth and land was just gone. You couldn't sell it. You couldn't even get a mortgage for it many times. So that was really a costly historical event for the other three men. It has occurred to me, though, that Madison ended up broke and couldn't keep Montpelier. Jefferson ended up broke and couldn't keep Monticello. But Monroe, the fellow who was persistent and kept going and going, he was able to leave his estate to his children. Now, they weren't able to afford it forever, but he accomplished more in that way just through sheer persistence. He thought the government owed him some money for salary and expenses. He didn't quit. He just wouldn't quit badgering the Congress for this money he thought he was owed. And in the end, he got it. So one of Monroe's friends wrote once, he has a mind neither rapid nor rich. A friend wrote that. But he went on to say he is so persistent, so dogged that he gets many things accomplished that others couldn't. And I think the fact that he ended up with his head at least slightly above water economically was a result of that.
Oh, that's why, yeah, that's why he's kind of a little bit the underdog in the story, and I have a lot of sympathy for him. In a way, though, Virginia, the Virginianness of it, kind of doomed these men because these were people who had staked their livelihood on farming, and the land in Virginia was just exhausted.
Yes.
So there was no way Madison was ever gonna. I mean, he also had a terrible stepson we could be discussing, who was spending money left and right and treating Montpelier like it was a garage sale. But but really, it was Virginia land itself and the market and their own debt practices that kind of did them in. But on the other hand, here's this little circle that you saw at the beginning, and in it contained these four brilliant men. Why Virginia?
Well, I think one important thing is that elite Virginians valued education and expected their sons to go to excellent schools. And at the same time, excellent schools were being created. There had just been too many PhDs. I don't know if you'll recognize this. Often there have been too many PhDs. But in this case, there were PhDs from Edinburgh, and there just were no jobs. And so many of them came to the United States, and they came to Virginia, where the interest in education was high. So the young men of Virginia often had really elegant education. So I think that's one factor. Virginia was very powerful. Once a man stood up before a crowd and he said, the importance of all these other states, colonies, to history is about the value of this snuff box. And it was the littlest snuff box you had ever seen. Virginia was big and proud and carried that reputation to the irritation sometimes of others with her sons wherever they went.
Yeah, in fact, I think I think Thomas Jefferson, when he would talk about my country,
yes, he meant Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, as I said, questions are coming in thick and fast. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to toss out a couple here.
Mm-hmm.
I have a request. Could you just say a word about President Monroe and the era of good feelings and the wonderful scene that John Quincy Adams witnessed between Monroe and Crawford at the end of it?
Well, I hope I've got the same scene in mind as your questioner. Crawford, as many people, wanted patronage jobs, and Monroe turned him down. So Crawford showed up at the White House and began swinging his cane at Monroe, whereupon Monroe grabbed a fire poker and began swinging it. No one was hurt, but it's sort of an interesting story to have occurring when, I guess, was the Oval Office. What else did he want to know, or she,
about the era of good feelings?
Oh, it's been debunked. People say this was no era of good feelings. There was this problem and that problem, but it wasn't as bad as periods before had been. Monroe won his second term by almost a unanimous vote of the Electoral College, lacked one vote. So his presidency was much appreciated. He left office greatly admired, which was very different from the way that Washington and Jefferson left office, in a state of great sorrow and resentment.
Oh, and just one of our learned viewers is affirming something you said. Stephen Kasloff says to us that Jefferson said his greatest legacy from his father was the gift of an education. So
Oh, that is a good quote.
that is a good quote. So a couple questions here about, oh, here's one. Did you draw on the work by Paul Jennings in writing your book? Paul Jennings being the Madison, formerly
Right.
slave valet. So this was
You
the
know,
first
I've
White House.
always, that is such a fascinating story, that Dolly ended up living very near where Paul Jennings did. I think Daniel Webster had made him his manservant, maybe he was free. And that Dolly was so poor at the end that Paul Jennings would bring her baskets of food and probably a little money now and then. He was formerly enslaved at Montpelier. So this is quite an interesting story. I didn't tell it because I thought of it as Dolly's story. And
And what Anthony is referring to is Paul Jennings goes on to write the first White House memoir.
aha,
So and he is of course the one that's with Madison when he dies.
is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's look it up. I thought only Suki was there and Dolly.
Oh, we'll have to look it up. Well, we can do that during cocktail time. So Alan brings up an interesting, he wants to contrast the way these men felt about slavery as a sort of necessary evil compared to how they felt, what they felt about the Native American destruction.
Hmm.
How did they feel about Native Americans?
Well, I think that what happened to Native Americans, deeply tragic, did not trouble them as much as the immorality of slavery. You know, you saw the enslaved people that worked your plantation every day. They were a part of your life. You understood that these were human beings every bit as much as you. You had to understand that in some way. And so they felt so deeply about the immorality of that practice. I don't think they did feel that deeply about pushing Native Americans off of their homelands, sending them far away from their homes, impoverishing them, robbing them of their ancestral beliefs and ideas. So I think that's a difference, but I'd sure be interested in other observations about it.
You know, that is interesting. Thank you, Alan. That was such a good question. Because I agree with you, but oddly, certainly Jefferson thought that there was no way to have a multiracial society when it was black and white. He just didn't see that how
That's
that would ever happen.
interesting. Mm-hmm.
But he did think that, you know, Native American people could be basically converted or rehabilitated and be incorporated into the white race. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. They don't have. I totally agree with your take on it, but they saw Native Americans as somehow, you know, I'm going to use one of their words, redeemable, in a way that
Well,
they just could not imagine a black and white society.
that and Jefferson was full of admiration for a Native American culture. You know, the front hall of Monticello is
Of course, yeah,
just a dream. The buffalo robes, and it's so beautiful.
yeah. So Tom wants to know, in your research, what was the most surprising thing you learned about James Madison?
Oh, about James Madison.
And I almost think you're going to have to go back to your earlier book because I'm sure you didn't learn anything terribly new after you wrote a whole biography.
Well, no, I did. James Madison was the most stable of the four presidents that I considered. I suppose someone might think him dull, but if you've read what he has written, what he wrote, if you look at the testimony of the time, people say that, you know, he could bring ideas forward in a way that inspired people to action. He was, despite the fact that this is the truth of him, he seemed colorless. but he was this peacemaker in a way. He didn't end up estranged from Jefferson or Monroe, though they ended up estranged from each other. He just had a way of trying to, when Jefferson went around Madison to try to prevent the ratification of the Constitution. And Madison found out about it. If Washington had had such a thing happen to him, if Monroe had had such a thing happen to him, there would have been fireworks everywhere. But Madison just sort of let it rest. And in the end, in a very cool way, let Jefferson know where his errors were. So that's what I've found out about Madison. When you look at him in comparison with others, you are struck by the emotional steadiness of the man. And I think that's part of what made him a great president.
Yeah. I also recall very early on when you were just starting the book. So one of the things you read over and over again about Madison is he was, quote, shy. He was shy. And especially like in comparison to Dolly, who was not shy. But I remember you saying to me, I don't think it's that he's shy. I think he's reticent. And he's got a kind of like, when you're the smartest guy in the room, you can stand back and just be.
Yes.
I thought that was a really interesting observation. So I stopped calling him shy. He just didn't go in. He didn't have to go in.
I call him reserved.
Reserved, that was the word.
Yes. Well, it's reticent is also true, but he just didn't feel a need to express himself on every question, whether he was an expert on it or not. It was simply his way to talk when necessary, to say what was necessary so that people would understand the importance of what this young country was about.
Yes, that was it. Reserved. I thought that was really put your finger right on it. All right, this is a hard one, Oliver. I don't know why you're doing this to her. Which of the four men has the greatest overall impact on the U.S. that we live in today?
Madison.
Yeah.
And I don't say this just because he's kind of my guy, but the Constitution has for, what is it, 237? I won't do the math right, but for all this time, it has been the foundation of what is still a unique nation. And it has been durable. It has kept us together. And Lord willing, it will continue to.
I'm with you too. Sorry, Oliver. We got to go with Madison. We have some lovely comments and a question from a good friend of the society named Bill, who actually performs as an interpreter of Madison for schools. He will also come to our events dressed as Madison, which I've always appreciated. And he says, it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. I agree. But Bill wants to know, I'm curious about how much of what the four of them did was limited by the necessity of appealing to their constituents. So it's the problem of being in politics. If you don't get elected, you can't do anything. So were they limited by their constituents?
Well, they had to work harder. I think of the ratification in Virginia, where, it was just very difficult to bring people around. But they were good politicians, Madison included. He knew how to work with people and bring them around to the point of view he thought they should be looking at the world from. So constituents don't seem to have been so much of a problem. I mean, the constituents that made Madison really mad were the Baptists, who, beat people who tried to listen to preachers who were in jail that the government had put them in. He just hated that. And so I think that's enough.
Yeah, and it just was a different political system. They weren't running for office in the same way,
right?
And they're much more beholden to their colleagues and their constituents, which oddly seems like very pertinent today. Here's a couple more comments. I love somebody who So Anthony says a good book on the topic of not to flog someone else's book, Lynn. Paul Jennings' book, Slave in the White House by Elizabeth Dowling Taylor, who we know. Stephen said Dolly became the sort of Pearl Mesta of her day, which is a nice reference, except greater as a former first lady and toward the end of her life, because despite the fact that she lived pretty close to the bone, everyone wanted to see her. She still was the queen of Washington City. Herb asks, and boy, Herb asked the hard question, this one too. Why did Madison agree to go to war with England in 1812?
Well, he tried hard to avoid it, but in the end, he could not. He tried these various approaches. If you'll quit impressing our men, we'll ship goods to you. And then he would change that set of policies to apply to the French instead of the English. He tried really hard. In the end, I think he wanted war. People often say that it was the war hawks in the Congress, these new men like Henry Clay, who were really anxious to prove themselves in the country. But I think Madison, in the end, thought that war was appropriate.
Yeah, and it was so interesting to me that there was no one moment. It was sort of like everybody wondering whether we're going to war, and then we go to war. But it's not like James Madison's writing, I sat down with the candle and I thought about this. We just happened. He went to Congress and asked them to declare war. So there's that moment, Herb, always that you wish you just had that one more document that would really just clear up that little, like, how did we get from here to there? Stephen is commenting, Madison's overcoming of Patrick Henry's intended religious tax was a masterstroke of political strategy. I like masterstroke of political strategy.
Well, this really proves Madison's political skill. The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which Jefferson had written and championed before he went to Paris, was passed under Madison's leadership. He knew how to work his way through so that Virginia had this marvelous statute. When it was passed, Madison wrote to Jefferson, "We have put to end forever the awful idea that you can control the human mind." It's beautiful.
So getting a little pushback here. Somebody asserts that John Adams was the smartest of all of them. I feel I must say that. It is a comment made by a native of Quincy, Massachusetts, so we'll take it. Here's a question. Charlie says, didn't Madison almost copy the state of Massachusetts Constitution when drafting the U.S. Constitution? Of course, this was authored mostly by John Adams.
I'm sure that Adams had influence because he was a very influential figure. And there have been many other claims that resolves in various New England states were responsible for the Constitution, or the South Carolina resolves. I don't know these stories well. But in the end, Madison was the master craftsman. In the end, it was he that pulled the convention together, that got people of reputation and respect, most important of all, George Washington, to attend. He then, led the ratification of the Constitution. He managed the whole tough question of when do you put in a Bill of Rights. He then put in a Bill of Rights once he was in Congress and the new nation was underway. What a politician.
Yeah. Eric reminds us that Dolly Madison wasn't really a Virginian. She was born in Guilford County, North Carolina, and became an adopted. So, Eric, I have to tell you, I could talk about an hour on that. The funny thing is, it was very important to Dolly's identity that she was a Virginian. And her claim was that her family was in Virginia, and she was born in North Carolina during a brief sojourn where basically her father's building failed. Because what I like about this is she lies about it. And when you find your subject lying about something, there's something about that. So she claimed Virginia. It was very important for her to be thought that. Now, this is really sad because North Carolina is so proud. She's the only first lady born in North Carolina. And it's the ladies of Greensboro, North Carolina in the 1960s
Mhm.
get together the princely sum of something like $10,000 by doing chicken dinners to
Uh-huh.
buy a huge collection of Dolly Madison's stuff.
Huh.
So I feel really badly that she kind of abandons North Carolina without a backward glance.
Well, but it was all part of building her image, that you wrote so well about in your book.
So James asks, in your book on Madison, you talk about how Madison used secrecy as a tool, and the Constitution was written in secret with secret committees continuing up through the 1970s. Madison believed that secret meetings limited partisan hardlining. Do you think this rise in modern transparency is a problem? That's very
Well,
interesting.
that is interesting. I do think it would have been very difficult for the Constitutional Convention to have succeeded if the debates were out of doors, and everyone could uh, become a part of the question about what should the president's powers be. And they could fight about that. I mean, they did in the end during ratification, but by then there'd been a coalescence. So I think that secrecy certainly helped there. In our society, you just couldn't get away with it.
Yeah, yeah.
You,
That's a
you
very interesting take. Absolutely. Um, Bob, one of our MHS community, says, how has it informed your own scholarship on these eminent people to have been yourself close to the centers of politics and power? President Kennedy said no one should write about the presidency unless they've sat behind the desk, which would certainly limit those who can write about the office.
Well, I just think I've been very lucky to have had such an education, and I certainly have come to think, and this is probably a result of my experience, that politics can be a noble profession. And I think that generally speaking, people disdain people who call themselves politicians. And in fact, not many politicians call themselves politicians, but it's a noble profession and it involves self-sacrifice. And I just like to make that point clear.
Yes. And Stephen says what's so extraordinary about all these people, including the non-Virginians, is that despite their clashing egos and ambitions and individual brilliance, each wanting to be number one, they came together to create the nation. So I think
Exactly.
exactly.
I appreciate that.
I think we have one more, and it's one you and I have talked about just for fun. With the idea, if suddenly there was a time machine and our four Virginians showed up, what would they make of us? What would they make of their national experiment?
Hmm. Well, I think they would first of all be surprised by the hustle and bustle, by all the people lobbying the Congress, the big buildings that house the bureaucracy. I think that the hustle and bustle, not just of government, but of society. When I think about Madison writing, being the architect of the Constitution, he had thought for years about that. And imagine thinking for years about a subject so important in the peace and quiet of Montpelier. I think they had a great deal of time for reflection and contemplation that we don't have. And they might have been appalled that we don't have it. You and I have talked before. I think technology would also just sweep them off their feet. Probably they wouldn't have time to learn about computers. I mean, depending on their age, if they were very young, they could do it. But planes, the idea that we're having private flights to Mars, it's just, it's astonishing. And they could never pass information along any faster than a horse could go. And the idea that they created what they did in an age when communications were so slow is amazing. And I think they'd be gratified that we had overcome that.
You had suggested this as just a kind of a fun way to think about it. And for me, it's also germ theory or the fact that there are germs. You do tell the story of the vaccination, speaking of something timely,
Mm-hmm.
vaccination that Washington vaccinated his troops. So they understood enough that it wouldn't be so alien what we were doing, but it would just be amazing when you think about how much of their lives were constrained by.
Yes, yellow fever.
Oh,
And they didn't understand that the mosquitoes were to blame. They just thought there was this word miasma, that it was bad air, and in a sense, I suppose they were right to want to get away from whatever it was. They went to their homes in the mountains because there were no mosquitoes there.
yeah, but you also talk about the stress that. So Jefferson has migraines.
Yes.
They're expressing things with their body that it would just be sort of amazing to them. Of course, I just think they would say, who is that woman running the historical society and why is she wearing pants? That's really, but
No, you're exactly right.
thank you so much for
Well,
making time for us. It's been wonderful having you here.
it's been my pleasure, and thank you for being such a gracious and insightful interviewer. I appreciate that.
I'm no Dolly Madison, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you both. And I'd also like to thank our audience and just encourage them to consider buying a copy of the Virginia Dynasty, which should be available at their local bookstore or at any of their online retailers. So thank you very much and have a good evening.